right, everyone. Welcome to the Stoa. Today we have Lene Rachel Andersen, a meta-modern Danish philosopher and author of such books as The Nordic Secret, The European Story of Beauty and Freedom, Bildung, Keep Growing, and Metamodernity, Meaning and Hope in a Complex World. And I have all her books because with me, because Lene was kind enough to gift me them when I was in Copenhagen, and we had a wonderful coffee together. And when we were talking, I got like a really deep download on metamodernity, and was contrasting that conversation to metamodernism. And I thought that was a pretty good contrast that's often not talked about at the Stoa and in adjacent spaces. And so I suggested to Lene, that could be the title of today's presentation and talk, and she agreed. And so I'm quite excited for this conversation because Lene is probably top of the game in the metamodernity philosophy space. So we're very lucky to have her here at the Stoa. So how today's going to work, I'm going to tag in Lene in a moment, and then she's going to share her thoughts and present on the topic at hand, and then we'll pivot to Q&A. If you have any questions anytime, put them in the chat. Colin, you can unmute yourself, ask your question to Lene. If you don't want to be on YouTube, just indicate that, and I'll read your question on your behalf. We're here for roughly 60 minutes, but if there's questions that are live, it might go a little longer. So that being said, Lene, welcome to the Stoa, and you have to unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you for reminding me to unmute. I guess this is the sort of pandemic faux pas where everybody starts talking and nobody can hear what you're saying. So thank you for that. It's great to be here. I've been looking very much forward to it. Should I just go ahead and start my my attack on metamodernism and metamodernity? Cool. So yeah, I have been writing books for the past almost 20 years now. I'm just gonna, not to brag, but I'm just gonna show how much paper I've actually spent in Danish. Those were my first 5 books, and they came out from 2005 to 2009. And there I wrote about big history, the origin of our species, of our civilization, and I also looked into chaos theory, complexity theory, network theory, and thermodynamics, and all the sort of patterns behind everything that happens, also the evolution, the biological as well as the cultural. So I have a rather big catalog of thinking on this. And then at some point in, I don't know, 2016, I think 15 perhaps, I was introduced to Daniel Gertz and Emil Einar Friis, who are the 2 guys behind Hansi Freinacht. And Daniel found metamodernism on the internet. I think it was he who did it, but definitely he was the one that I got it from. And it was the cultural theory defined by the 2 Dutch cultural theorists, Robin van den Akker and Timotheus Vermeulen. And there was something there that just resonated with what we were talking about and what I had been writing for all these years. And so I actually wrote a book. This must have been even earlier, because the first book where I wrote about metamodernism and quoted Van den Akker and Vermeulen was in 2014. It was a Danish book, so I can't really quote a lot from it here. But the whole thing about the modernism and the postmodernism and this superposition or juxtaposition or both and or a double feeling or whatever you want to call it resonated with us. And then I wrote this book in 2014 called Globally Shifting Up, like going culturally on warp speed. The more I worked with it, the more I realized that there was something missing, because modernism and postmodernism are an extremely short period of time in the human existence. I mean, as a species, we have something that went before it that some people call the pre-modern. And when I talk about the pre-modern, it's the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. So maybe the past, I don't know, 6,000 or 8,000 years, 5,000, 6,000 years before the modern era. And then before that, there was all the hunter-gatherer and Stone Age agriculture and other kinds of organizing society. And that I realized that that was missing from the Metamodernism. And so I started thinking about, so what characterized the civilization, the cultural code, the moral values, the ways of understanding the world, the epistemes that went before the modern era. And so I decided that, okay, for cultural codes, it also has to be, handleable. I mean, we need to be able to have some big chunks that we can talk about. And of course, the more you simplify things and the broader the categories you make, the more loose and imprecise they are, and you can make more mistakes, but you can also talk about things in broader terms. So I would like to share what I came up with and what I've been working on since, which is what I call metamodernity. And as you can see here, I work with 4 cultural codes, and I am currently reading the Dawn of Everything by David Graeber and David Wengrow. And so I do know that this is full of mistakes, but some of the mistakes I'm very happy to correct. And there are some books that I need to rewrite, including the 5 ones that I just showed you before. But nevertheless, I mean, there is a time of a very, very long time of human existence before writing and before what you can call, I mean, if we just define cultures by communication technologies, then we have a long period of time before writing and before we can actually document where people were thinking with any kind of written sources. So I now call that the indigenous or prehistoric cultural code. And as you can see here, the way that I have, I mean, the main characteristics of that cultural code is that it has been very egalitarian, that people have had in many places, not everywhere. I mean, this is the broad picture, an idea of order and chaos. The world was magical. People were very pragmatic. There were belief systems, and there was a lot of myth, which was what carried the factual information about the world. And the biggest stable groups were tribes or clans, and the world was given in a way where you couldn't really manipulate it or change it in any major ways. And typically also people had a circular understanding of the world, a circular concept of time, a circular concept of life. And then nature was spirited, and people were part of nature, and the spirits in nature were part of who you were. And so, and we've spent maybe 200,000 years or more with that kind of reality. I'm going to get to the time frames in a second. But if we look at the indigenous and say, okay, so this is what was before the invention of writing, it covers hunter-gatherers, it covers settled hunter-gatherers, and it covers agriculture in the Stone Age. And given that we have spread around the globe, if you go into more details, you will find that this list is, of course, not complete. And there are many places where some of this is not the case. But to get a broad overview of what this period was like, or what the culture was like, and where we're coming from, this is how I chose to describe it. And then there's the traditional or pre-modern society, and that is really the Bronze Age. And it begins around, 5,000-6,000 years ago. And in Europe, the Iron Age, many historians talk about the medieval times as a separate period. I would say it's just a late part of the Iron Age, so really until the Renaissance. But this is where we have the really big settled societies, the ring-walled cities, and the hierarchical societies and patriarchy. And this is where the modern sense of what we describe as religion today, the organized practice, rituals, narrative, keeping society together, hundreds of thousands of people having similar ideas about what is a good person, what are the moral values in the society, emerges with this era. And then faith becomes a thing, particularly with Judaism and Christianity. but also Islam, and truth becomes an issue beyond what you could call myth, and then it's organized in the town or the city. A linear understanding starts appearing, particularly with Judaism, but also in Christianity. So linear with regards to there's a beginning to the world and there's an end to the world, but also because the individual gets a different kind of role in the world. Because you're an individual who has a unique character, a unique place in the world, there is also a beginning in your life and an end to your life in this world. It may continue in another world, but it's a linear story about what your life is like. The modern world reintroduces an egalitarian ideology. We create democracy, secularization, doubting rather than dogma. We create the scientific process, and we pursue facts rather than truth or myth or beliefs. And then the nation state becomes the really big organizing entity, the legal entity that defines people's rights and obligations. And we have the Newtonian physics and a worldview that is based on that. And whether you want to say that it begins with Gutenberg and the printing press in the 1400s, or it's the beginning of the industrialization, or maybe in the 1800s, it's a process. It didn't just happen in one day. So it's a long period of time before we can really say that now the world is modern. And of course, speaking as a woman, when did women get the right to vote and be considered fully adults? When we turned 18 in Denmark, it was in 1915. And I know that in other parts of the West, it was around the same time. So it takes a while before it's really there. And then the postmodern, you can say it's been since the 90s, but you can also say that Nietzsche started introducing the postmodern. And of course, you can discuss when it's there, but let's just say it's 30 or 50 years perhaps. So these big cultural zones or cultural codes, I think, are necessary in order for us to understand who we are and where we're coming from and where our civilization or any civilization is coming from. And if we only have the modern and the postmodern, we can simply not understand what it means to be human, and we don't understand where things are coming from. And so the metamodernism that people usually talk about, and whenever people explore metamodernism philosophically, either as an emotion, which is one version of metamodernism, it's a sensibility, but it can also be described as an epoch or an episteme, or there are many ways of relating to metamodernism. It is generally just the modern and the postmodern, and I simply think it's not enough, because we also bring with us, not just in our language and from religious traditions, but also in our institutions and legislation, heritage from the traditional. And we are born as indigenous people. I mean, whenever somebody has a baby, they basically bringing another Stone Age person into this world. The problem or the challenge with these cultural zones, if we look at it through history, is that there has always been a conflict between them, and any civilization that is probably not politically correct to say it, but has moved on, has grown bigger, has created a more complex society where you had to, and this is really the process in this, the increasing societal complexity and the size of society and the complexity in technology, for instance, in discourse and in communication technology, allows bigger and bigger groups to be coherent. But there are two ways of doing that. One is that you use the old cultural code mode of understanding the world, and then you have to use increasing amounts of violence in order to keep huge groups together, expanding groups together. Or you can distribute the responsibilities and the freedoms in society and allow people to self-organize locally and have a different kind of personal responsibility and individuality as societies grow. And when you have this increased sense of personal freedom and responsibility, and you keep larger groups together through different kinds of narrative, different kinds of communication technology. I mean, we can, if we look at the traditional pre-modern communication technology, it was just, I mean, to begin with, it was picture writing, then it became alphabet, then it went from scrolls to index books that were tied together at the back. And then we get if you look at the Roman Empire, you can say that the roads in the Roman Empire were part of the communication technology, because you could send messages from one end of the empire to the other in, I don't know, a week or something like that. And then we get to the modern era, and we have the printing press, and we have the typewriter, and we got the rotation press, and then we have the radio and television, and you can communicate to more and more people and keep them together with a shared narrative and have a civilization that grows. But in order for that to work without immense amounts of violence, you have to allow people to make more decisions independently from the top-down regulation of everything. And so as these societies grow and you give more individual range for everybody, looking from the older perspective, from the smaller society, the bigger society, the more modern, let us call it that, society looks amoral, because you don't have an understanding that can decipher what are the moral values there. And then we've had a tendency from the bigger, more modern society to look back at the smaller societies with the older cultural code and call them primitive. And that isn't just something that we came up in Europe among white men 500 years ago. If you look at the Mesopotamians in, like, what is that, 4,000 years ago, if you look at the big epos Gilgamesh, there's a story about the wild guy from the steppes, and he is introduced to civilization, actually through sleeping with a prostitute. But so when he tasted wine and wore clothes for the first time, he got a bath and he slept with her and he got wine and clothes, and now he was suddenly civilized. And one of the ways that Gilgamesh, the text, describes it is that he could not talk to the animals out there in the wilderness anymore. And so the Mesopotamians, the city dwellers, looked down upon the wild people outside of civilization. And of course, you have it in the Hebrew Bible. The people who were already living in the Holy Land were considered not as advanced as the Jews. And then you have Christianity saying the same thing about the Jews. And then you have Islam saying the same thing about Christianity and Judaism. So we've all done that one way or the other. And I think it's one of those sort of patterns, mechanisms that are behind all of us. And it's really hard to get beyond that. But with the knowledge that we have today, we can see this. And we can see these conflicts. And I think many of the conflicts that we've seen in the world have simply been because one group of people had technology that was more advanced than their neighbors, and they figured out that we can steal stuff and we can enslave them and we can live in more abundance of different kinds if we take this from these people, or if we take their land or something like that. So, and of course, then you've had all this, these cultural codes or epistemes to justify that you conquer all these people who do not have the same level of communication technology or individual freedom or whatever it is that you call it. So this is the historical background. And then when I get to metamodernity, my suggestion is that we get the best from all of these cultural codes. And the question then is, of course, what would that look like? I mean, can we do this? And therefore, I think of metamodernity as something we have to choose. It's not something that just happens. It won't just emerge out of happenstance and good luck. We really have to focus on this, because what we can create is that we can take the best from all of these different cultural codes. And how do we decide what is best? I would say it depends on the group size. So when we are in intimate settings, when we are at the workplace, when we are in local communities where we know everybody, we can go to the indigenous and learn from their sense of spirituality, egalitarian ways of organizing, the connection to nature, the connection to local community. If we go into bigger local neighborhoods, big workplaces for that matter, companies with 3,000-4,000 people, that's when we need a hierarchy. That's where we need different kinds of rituals in order to keep people to pull in the same direction. And we can learn a lot from the traditional and the pre-modern. We still need the modern, of course. We need science, we need democracy, we need human rights, and we can't afford to lose these. And then from the postmodern, we acquire the ability to sort of move out and look at all of this from the outside and say, okay, so what do we pick and choose? We can also do this completely wrong and have the billions of people on the globe being ruled by modern technologies, by a tiny group of people from one family who decides everything, and have this hierarchy where everybody is just forced to live in one way according to a set of dogma that you cannot do anything about. So, and some people call this hypermodernity. So we can do it all wrong. I would definitely recommend that we do it right. We combine these cultural codes and these human experiences in the most fruitful way for all of us. And if I'm just to say a few things about, so why is it so important that we bring in that which is older than the modern and the postmodern, and
in progress,
what it means to be human, is that if we look at the time frame, and if we say that 50 years is 1 millimeter, I got this really advanced piece of AV equipment with me here. So it's like a multimedia presentation. So if this is the direction of time, and postmodernism is 50 years, and that is like 1 millimeter. I don't know if you can see it, but it's like this little tiny space here. I will bring in a bigger pen that you can see, but this is how short postmodernism is. Then if we look at modernity and say that it is 100 years, that will give us, I mean, the 20th century, that will give us 1 more millimeter. You can't even see it here, I guess. And then if we say, okay, so the modern world is 500 years, then at least we have 1 centimeter. Now it's so big that I can draw it. So, I mean, this is 500 years. And then if we go back to the beginning of the Christian calendar, I mean, that's 2,000 years. This is how much it is. And this is time. Oops. So these are the past 2,000 years. And then if we go back to the last ice age, which is really when the waters rose and all of these many hunter-gatherers and indigenous peoples were probably squeezed together on less land and therefore had to reorganize. And you can say this is really the dawn of civilization. That's the last big climate change. If that is 12,000 years, and each of these 50 years is 1 millimeter, then it's about 24 centimeters. So, I mean, this is the ice age, end of the ice age, 12,000 years ago. And then before that went 200,000 years of human beings. And if this is about, I don't know, 24 centimeters, 7 inches or something like that, the time that there have been human beings living in indigenous societies would be about 4 meters, which is, I tried to figure this out, 13 feet. So somewhere out there, 13 feet in that direction would be the indigenous human experience, that which we are coming from, that we're born to be. And therefore, I mean, if we don't understand all of this and just define a metamodernism that, yeah, contains this little part here, it is simply not enough to understand who we are as human beings, and is not enough to have meaningful relationships and communities and societies. And so on that note, I will just leave history behind me, so to speak, and And here, if you have any questions or comments.
Awesome. Yeah, well done on the that presentation. Quite enjoyed it. And if anyone has any questions, put your questions in the chat now, and I'll call on you in a moment. I'm just going to remove the spotlight. Do this. Okay, so my first question is to kind of double click on the modernity versus metamodernism piece. I was wondering if you can kind of like feel into that a little bit more, and then kind of like, when we were talking, you were criticizing the integral theory and Ken Wilber, and how he got some things wrong, and how a lot of people are conflating integral theory and metamodernism today. So I was wondering if you could speak on that a little bit more.
Sure. I mean, when I first heard about metamodernism from Vermeulen and van den Akker, it was a cultural theory, and it's came out of the academic environment. And I have been writing about the evolution for the past 20 or 25 years. And so my background is science, and a very yeah, I mean, my understanding of the evolution comes from science, and it is a very simple theory that says reproduction, variation, and selection. And with that, you can actually explain how some molecules at some point 1.5 billion years ago managed to replicate themselves, make identical copies, and through variation, growing, or whatever you want to call it, evolving into being more complex, eventually building a membrane around them, and then creating much more advanced membranes. And then 560 million years ago, the Cambrian explosion, which was multicellular life. So science can actually explain, without any kind of purpose in the evolution or direction in the evolution, how all this complexity emerged. And what I get from Ken Wilber, and I've tried to read him several times, and I've always ended up putting the book away after 50 pages, because he keeps insisting on a purpose in history, that there is something beyond the evolution as Darwin described it. I know that within biology and the study of evolution now, there is an increasing number of examples of species that have merged in one way or the other. And one of the examples is locusts, where you have, how come that suddenly you can have these swarms of locusts? It's as if they came from nowhere, and suddenly they're there, and they eat everything, and they're devastating to plants and the farmers who depend on the land and all that, and then suddenly they disappear again. And one of the explanations is that it's actually two species that have at some point merged together, so that when they appear as locusts, it is because they take upon them that species. So they carry the DNA of both species, and then when they're done with eating and there's nothing more left, they go back to being that other species, and I forgot which species that is. So it's not quite as simple as Darwin predicted or envisioned. And the interesting thing is that there isn't anybody in science who has been able to prove Darwin wrong. And I would say any scientist who could prove Darwin wrong, I mean, he or she would get the Nobel Prize instantaneously, because that would be such a huge sensation that it simply wouldn't be possible to keep it secret if somebody actually came out and proved Darwin wrong. So my first complaint about integral thinking and Ken Wilber is that he simply adds something to evolution that is not scientific. And you're allowed to do that, but then please call what you're doing religion. And you're free to create your own religion, but don't call it science. So I don't like that mix. And if the integral movement was explicit about calling this the integral religion, that would be fine. But if you call it an integral theory, an integral movement, and kind of claim that it is scientific, but without having the scientific process, and by adding something that has nothing to do with science, I find it very problematic. And then, of course, if you then just take this one philosophy or religion and then kind of tweak it a little bit and then say, we like this metamodernism thing, let's call what we're bringing in metamodernism, because now this is the new exciting thing. Those of us who need metamodernism and metamodernity as a term for something else, be it a movement in the arts, a sensibility, a sense of things being different, an emotion, or as I describe it, as an epoch, and in my case, not just an epoch of modernity and postmodernism, but an epoch that brings in everything from our past, and where we make a deliberate choice of what kind of future we want. Then I find it very counterproductive to have this sort of religious movement appropriating a concept that we need for something else. And I would have said the same thing if it had been the Catholic Church or the Salvation Army or any other religious movement that would have come in and said, we are metamodern. So that's the problem that I have with it.
The other question I'll ask, then we'll pivot to the question.
Oh yeah, I have one more, but there's one more thing also, which is that I see metamodernity as an ethical, cultural, if not moral choice. I mean, this is something that we deliberately have to choose. It won't happen if we just sit around and wait for it, because there are economic interests, there are technologies that are evolving so fast. We're being connected. I mean, we're probably, going around the globe right now with this conversation. And so there are things that are being invented and bringing us together in new ways. And the community that we're in are about to reach 8 billion people. There's about, 2 or 3 billion people who aren't even on the internet yet. So it's a moral choice if we want everything, everybody to benefit from this. It won't just happen. What I hear from Ken Wilber is that there is an order in the universe that more or less automatically will bring us to the point where we're all more enlightened and where everything is at a higher level of complexity, freedom, and spiritual enlightenment. And I just don't think that will happen by itself. That mechanism is not there.
Mm-hmm. And my other question is somewhat related to some of the stuff you just said. Our friend at the Stoa, John Vervaeke, he talks about the meaning crisis often. Your colleague, Thomas, talks about the meta crisis, and the Club of Rome, they call it the mega crisis and whatnot. Through this picture that you just painted with the kind of the lens of the cultural codes and learning how to speak them and embrace them from a meta-modernity perspective, how is that a response to the meta crisis and the meaning crisis?
Very much so, because I think much of the meaning crisis, I think the meta crisis and meaning crisis, at least the way that I would use the words, are two different things. The meaning crisis is, can we understand what is going on? Is my life meaningful? Am I anxious? Do I feel anxiety all the time? Am I depressed? Do I not? Can I grasp what is going on, or can I not? And then there is the meta crisis, which is what is actually happening out there. So, I mean, there's microplastics, and there is mass extinction of species, and there's climate change, and there's AI, and there are killer drones, and there's a pandemic, and all kinds of amazing things going on that can kill us in so many fascinating ways and create so much havoc. And these are two different things. One is, how do we understand this? And the other one is, what is going on? And we need, in order to understand this and ourselves in this world, it is my claim that we need all of this. I mean, we need these different aspects of life, and we need the indigenous prehistoric experience and intimate ways of creating communities and being together in order to feel that we belong somewhere. We also need the big cultural traditions, the religious traditions with their poetry and their cathedrals, temples, beauty, all those expressions, poetic expressions of what it means to be human that we have in written form, where we can see how did other generations handle the struggle of being human in a world where you can't always have it the way that you want and you need to be on your own in a huge society where you don't know everybody. And then, of course, the modern world and the science, and when we face a pandemic like we're facing now, understanding what is actually a virus, what is a vaccine, who are the institutions that can help us, what is the scientific process that describes this virus, and what is the scientific process that can produce a vaccine. And if you never learned science in school, or you didn't learn it well, and you don't understand the scientific process, if you have no idea about what it means that something is peer reviewed, and that people, in order to actually make a living as a scientist, have to constantly fight over who's right and who's wrong, and where the most amazing thing you can do as a scientist is to prove your colleagues wrong, because then everybody will quote you and you will get tenure. If people don't know this process, it's very easy to create conspiracy theories about what scientists are doing. So if you understand this process, there's a part of the meaning crisis that you just won't experience, because you can see through many of these things, and they don't appear as something mysterious going on behind a veil of sorts. And then, of course, there's the meta crisis with all these things going on. And in order to solve these things, we also need all the knowledge from the modern science. We also need the postmodern ability to sort of zoom out and see things from different perspectives, not just our own. And so, I mean, the more education we can have, the more conversations we can have, the more dialogues between people, among people with different professional backgrounds, life situations, academic backgrounds, and so forth, the more we can solve both the meaning crisis and the meta crisis.
Excellent. We're going to have, I imagine, related questions to that in the Q&A portion, which we'll pivot to now. Let's go with Michael first. Michael, if you can ask one of your questions.
Sure. Yeah, I'll start with the first one. So you talked about the importance of getting this right, and I've seen and read a lot of YouTube videos and blog posts about the current movements, Game B, the Stoa, the Impact Journey, and also the Learning Society. But what are the current big projects and institutions working towards getting it right? I can see there should probably a couple of thousands people showing up in a conversation like this if this was wider spread. So why isn't that? Where are all the people who thinks about these questions you ask?
They are in more places than you think. 10 years ago, they weren't there, but the UNESCO are addressing some of these things. I was just participating in a 3-day conference online where people are talking about, so what should be the future of education? The World Academy of Arts and Sciences just had a 3-day online webinar where people were discussing this. Some of the best scientists and people from the established institutions are beginning to address this. The Club of Rome, where I'm a member, have been addressing this for 50 years now. The Limits to Growth came out in 1972. So, I mean, there are people out there. One of the things that I also, and that's why the whole, I would say the Metamodernism and Metamodernity Game B movements, and there's also something like what's it called? Not cyberpunk. No, anyway, so solar punk, exactly. Thank you. I mean, there are all these movements, and I think that both in the established organization systems, institutions, and in a movement like this, people need to meet. So I would say in both camps, we need to look from this sort of underground YouTube Stoa meeting place, we need to look to the established institutions. And at the established institutions, there needs to be a sensibility towards these underground intellectual movements, because we could really learn a lot from each other. So I would say there is a growing awareness that we need a different kind of approach to ourselves in the world. And one thing that I find interesting, a little bit troubling actually, about the whole metamodernism integral emerge, this whole subculture thing, is that people talk a lot about inner development and meditation and spirituality, which is of course important, but there's no link to, at least not in what people say. I think there are people who are actually active in regenerative agriculture, in the eco movements of different kinds, but the whole environmental side also seems separate from the mental side. So I think we're having all these little subcultures, each focusing on one topic. And I think the ecosystem of people dealing with these challenges is much bigger, and should really be mapped as much bigger than just the game B metamodernism ecosystem, and then the ecosystem, and then you have the institutions with all the resources and the education. So we need to find each other, and one of the reasons why that may be hard is that I think that many of us in this sort of underground YouTube movement are not part of the established institutions, because we never fitted in there. And so that sense of not fitting in makes it hard, of course, to then approach the institutions where people have had good careers because they did fit in. But I think that in both places, people are seeing some of the same things and are reaching many of the same conclusions. So that actually gives me hope.
Any quick follow-up share, Michael?
Yeah, fantastic to do that. And I'm part of that. I'm working with Bertola Bergstrand, who have been researching the mapping part for 15 years, and he calls that role both the weaver, the one who connects people, and also the navigator, the one who does the exploration. And we've been working on this project we call Learning Society, where we see a new role for these types of let's say workplace roles in all institutions, that those both the navigating and the weaving. So I mean, very interesting to explore that further, how we can bring all these different silos in this world as well together in this. So.
Cool. Thanks, Michael. Sarah, I'll take you in next. You can ask one of your questions. All right. Looks like she's relocating to a spot where she can, maybe we'll take in someone else. Well, okay, looks like she's.
Sorry, just I couldn't speak inside. Yeah, one of my questions would be, where do you think, which are the places that really embody metamodernism? Are there some physical places that for you can really represent all this spirit, or is it more global culture thing, rather online?
I think we have to create spaces for metamodernity. So, I mean, we're experimenting with it here in Copenhagen at the think tank that we've started, Nordic Bildung, and we have a Danish chapter of it where we host events. And whenever we have an event, we make sure, I mean, the topic is usually science, something that points towards the future, some of the challenges that we're facing. But we always open the meeting with a traditional song. And we bring in texts from the global world heritage. So we had an event about trees, and he's actually an actor, but he loves trees and can talk about them for hours. And so we started with a children's song about a birthday party in the forest among all the animals. And then we had the presentation about the trees. And then we had a reading from the Hebrew Bible with the tree of knowledge and the tree of life. And then we had a reading from the Norse mythology about the tree Ask Yggdrasil, which was the tree of life in the Norse mythology. And so we brought in this mythology and the Bible into this conversation about how important trees are and what we know from a scientific angle about trees. And we've had an event about animism and spirituality and our relationship to nature from a guy who is a historian of religion. And so he speaks about, he's trying to reinvigorate Old Norse animism, and there's actually a winter ritual called Krampus. So I don't know if you are familiar with these straw goats that are traditional Christmas decoration. They used to be these monsters where people were wearing straw masks with horns, and then they were running through the streets and making all kinds of noise to scare away the evil spirits. And it turns out that this was actually something that people did across Europe. I spoke to somebody from Portugal and somebody from Ukraine the other week, and they knew the tradition. I didn't know it here in the Nordics until about 6 months ago when this historian told me about them. So we're bringing in these different traditions, and we're bringing them in through science and through narrative and through singing and through storytelling. And then we create meaning out of that. And sometimes people get a very scientific presentation. Sometimes people get a very personal story, but we make sure that we have something from the postmodern, the modern, and the pre-modern in all events. And then we have, if the topic relates to the prehistoric, then we also have that in the event. But if the topic has nothing to do with prehistory, it's hard bringing it in because there are no written sources. For everybody, I think there is something familiar in the content, something that you know, like one of the children's songs. And then there's something that they've never heard before, but which suddenly makes sense, or they've known it before, but it didn't make sense because they didn't know the context. But now they hear it read out loud in relationship to something that they do relate to, and then we have a conversation about it, and then suddenly it opens up. We had a philosophical question at one of our events, which was, so Santa's little helpers, these little elves, you also see them in the Christmas stories. What is such an elf? What is it actually? And our historian, and people came up with all kinds of good expressions or explanations for it. It's like this little trickster. It's like a garden elf. It's like this Christmas decoration, all kinds of stuff. But this historian, he came up with a really good explanation of how farmers in the Nordics 200 years ago had a relationship to this little elf, which was, and he illustrated it with the Inuits, because they live so close, in a close relationship with the ocean. But the ocean it brings food, but is also really dangerous. And so you have to show an immense respect towards this ocean. And that relationship between you and the ocean, that is the elf. And then when you take that concept of respect between you and nature to the farmer in the pre-modern era, who had to till the soil and plant and harvest, and it was really hard work, and there was all these rituals related to it. But there was also the story about the elf to whom the land belonged. And so the elf there was also the relationship between the farmer and the land. And you had to take really good care of the land, otherwise this little elf would haunt you and create all kinds of havoc. And so this opened a whole, interesting discussion about, so where does food come from? What is our relationship to the land? What is our relationship to nature? And what is our relationship to these little elves with the pointy hats that ended up helping Santa packing all the packages for all the good children? So so we bring these things together, and personally, I find it very meaningful, and I also get the sense that other people have this sort of, wow, I never looked at Santa's Little Helpers from this perspective before. So we have to create it, and that's why it's a choice. And I think there are movies out there now, and there is art that are kind of presenting this. And there was an American movie about 2 years ago called Midsummer, which means midsummer. It's Swedish, takes place in Sweden, in this prehistoric pocket that has survived up to modern times, when a group of American college students go to visit their Swedish exchange student in that sort of prehistoric pocket that has survived somewhere in the Swedish forests. And if you can find it online or on video or something, you should absolutely watch it, because the rituals that are in that movie, and the ethics, the moral values, the stories, our good friend, the historian of religion, says they're true. So somebody did their research and created an amazing and gory story about these prehistoric Swedes that have survived until our day and age. And I won't tell how many of the participants get killed.
It's a good film. I recommend watching it. Is there any follow-up shares? Or you have to run outside again? Okay, good. So let's perhaps maybe the last question, Johannes, if you can ask one of your questions.
Hi, Lene, yeah, that was fantastic. I don't know where to begin. I'm an evolutionary biologist, so I'm always a little, so what you said about Wilbur, maybe we start there, that evolution doesn't have sort of an endpoint. I totally agree, but if you were talking before, could you clarify what you meant by Darwinian evolution before? Because I think just this view of just competition and survival of the fittest seems very sort of modern to me, and very mechanistic, very brutal. And we need something more like that brings in especially inner worlds and agency in meta-modern philosophy. I was just wondering, so how can you reconcile such a view of evolution towards complexity? You know, maybe the one that Stuart Kauffman is sort of propagating or something like that, with this idea of these fixed stages. I mean, how should we treat those stages? Is that, I see them more as a sort of a tool than a representation of reality, because in reality what happens is that the sort of cognitive processes and the practices we have to complexify together with our societies, rather than sort of you know, looking at our cognitive and practical toolkits as a sort of a static thing. I mean, I thought metamodernism was all about thinking more in process terms, and then we always use these stage theories. So I wondered how you were thinking about how to reconcile your classification scheme with an evolutionary view of history that way.
Right. So I don't think that evolution just, you know, went in like one direction and smoothly, you know, or even with certain leveling off and then going to another level of complexity and then going to another level of complexity, as the dinosaurs. I would rather say that we have evolution of complexity, and then it goes and hits some, I mean, suddenly there's a balance in the ecosystem. And then there is no, actually what happens is that you have species that kind of fluctuate in their evolution around a balance point. And then something happens, like here are all the dinosaurs. And then suddenly there's this meteorite, and then the dinosaurs, they disappear. But then you have, because they disappear, some other species can evolve in increased complexity, and then they hit some kind of balance. And there is no evolutionary advantage in deviating from that balance. So you have sort of an oscillation around this point. And so evolution really goes in these different patterns. And then from time to time, you have this decomplexity, you have things that crash and that change the circumstances. And the reproduction, whether it's the first piece of DNA, or it's advanced organisms like you and me. If we reproduce, there is variation in what comes out of that reproduction. And it's not just competition that decides whether you survive or not, or if that variation is an advantage or not. It's also how well do you fit in? How well do you communicate with the rest? I mean, is your metabolism too fast for the environment? I mean, do you eat up everything before you can reproduce again, for instance? So it's not just about competition, it's also about symbiosis and collaboration and sharing of resources and being able to be in that balance. And there are all these species that disappear or crash that we don't even know of. So so the variation that leads to a selection, I mean, the selection is it can be whether you're faster and stronger, but it can also be whether you are slower and have use less resources. So so I still think the basic process of reproduction, variation, and selection is still out there, and there is not, and that's the point. It is not that something selects. I mean, the something doing the selection isn't there, and there's a lot of happenstance in who survives. Nobody decided that the dinosaurs should go extinct. It just happened to be that a meteorite hit Earth and they couldn't survive, but there were all these little mammals that suddenly could, and there was all this open space left for them when the dinosaurs were gone, and they were not dinner anymore. So, I mean, there was room for something new to evolve, and then with enough time, we were there. So, so I mean, we're really here out of pure luck. You and I would have been rodents if it hadn't been for the extinction of the dinosaurs.
So I was just wondering if I may follow up very quickly. How do you connect that picture to the evolution, this very logical, succession of stages that you have? It's just, for me, this is something in meta-modern discussions that always creates a bit of so how we have a dynamic view of the world. How do we get these sort of static stages, and what role are these, your stage model, what role is it playing? Is it just a tool to think about people and how they think, or is it a model that represents reality in some way?
It's probably a little bit of both. Of course, I mean, the way that I've split it up into 4 cultural codes is not a fair representation of the human evolution, because there has been, back and forth, and there's been a little bit up and down, and there's been trial and error, and then there was a natural disaster, and then what people had spent thousands of years creating just disappeared. And so there are these different dynamics. And if you look at, I mentioned the medieval times before, I mean, if you look at the period between the year 400 and 1400, so the beginning of the Christian era in Europe and until the invention of the printing press with movable type, there is barely anybody, it's 1,000 years, there's barely any philosopher or scientist from Europe that we still quote today. But if you go from the 1400s until today, and if you go until 400 in the Common Era, we quote Cicero and Aristotle and all these Greek philosophers and Roman emperors. And then you have this gap where dogma took over, and they built some amazing cathedrals. I mean, it's not like people didn't do anything, but there was a dogmatic approach to knowledge, and you were not allowed to know the wrong things. And so they shut down everything. And you see a similar development right now in Iran and Saudi Arabia. You see similar movements in all authoritarian societies, where people in power are really afraid of the population understanding what the world is like and finding out things on their own, thinking for themselves, self-organizing and distributing power and responsibility and freedom. And so this is a whole other discussion about, so how can we have stable societies with the technologies, not least the communication technologies that we have, and how can we match the personal responsibility and freedom to the group sizes and the complexity level of the technologies. So I do see a development towards increased complexity and towards increased personal responsibility and autonomy and freedom in order for it to work. But it's not one smooth path, and it's not, you know, without its bumps on the road and you know, collapses of all kinds of things.
Thank you, Johannes. So we're past the top of the hour. We're going to close here. Just wanted to, any final closing thoughts you'd like to leave with us before we close out today?
I would just say thank you for listening and for your questions and for allowing me to talk about this. It's really important to me, and I think it's important to all of us that we figure out what kind of future do we want, and that we have conversations about that, because if we don't make that a deliberate choice, we'll all end up in Mark Zuckerberg's metaverse. And yeah, I don't feel like going there. So we need to figure out, what do we want, and we should be much better at talking about that. Nobody wants that. I think we all agree on that. So how do we avoid it? How do we get to where we do want to be?
Yeah, definitely. I don't think anyone wants that, especially here at the Stoa. Yeah, I'll make some closing announcements in the moment. But Lene, thank you so much for coming to the Stoa, and thank you for giving me your books. Quite enjoying them. It was great connecting with you in person when I was in Copenhagen. And Copenhagen is an amazing city. It's so cozy. I gotta come back. We have another event. Today's sort of like an informal meta-modern symposium at the Stoa. We have Jason Storm coming in to do Metamodernism, The Future of Theories, a new book. I haven't read it, so someone else is going to MC that one. So that's about an hour at 12 p.m. Eastern time. So if you want to check that out, you can RSVP on thestoa.ca. So that being said, everyone, thank you so much for coming to Stoa today.